All right. It is summer, 2024, and this is New South Christians. We are getting ready to fire up for a new semester, and so we had an opportunity to meet with this young man to my left. His name's Christian. I'm going to get him to introduce himself in just a minute, but for any of you that haven't ever watched the podcast before, just to give you a little background, my name's David Fuqua. I teach here at Vol State, but this doesn't have anything to do with my economics class. This has to do with a whole lot more. And it's so exciting. Last semester, really for the first time, doing the podcast, putting it together, some of the stuff behind the scenes that's even going on now. I learned so much. I tell people, Christian, that I learned more about students in 35 minutes than I just finished my 38th year of teaching.
38 years?
Yeah, 38 years. So it blows me away. And I'm just so thankful that I found this, even though it's later in life. So however much longer I'm going to be at Vol State doing this podcast, I'm excited. So we're coming back after, I guess, a summer break, if you want to call it that. Gentleman to my left is going to introduce himself. His name's Christian. I don't know if that's a cosmic thing. We do New South Christians. The first guest coming into the fall is Christian. So go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Well, I think, first of all, it was just meant for me to be here with my name fitting into this podcast. But I've gotten to watch a few episodes. And my very good friend, Jessica Myers, already been on your podcast. Yeah. We actually are partners as well together, where we are working on a podcast diving into life after college or during college and people figuring out what they want to do. So it's interesting that you're doing this podcast and still, even though you're in like 20-ish episodes in or so.
Oh, yeah. We passed 20, we're 22, 23, something like that.
So, I mean, even then, there's still things to learn going into it. But but you're getting into a point now where I think you're probably even more experienced than us, learning about how this podcast industry is working and why it's becoming such a big hit all of a sudden. But yeah, so a little bit about me is I went to Vol State from 2019 to 21. Then later on, I got my bachelor's degree at Western Kentucky from 21 to 23. So very interesting about my background in religion. So I am also a member of the Church of Christ. So when I told people at my congregation at the time about going to a public college, most of them were like, well, okay, go and do that, but make sure that you surround yourselves with mainly Christians. But I feel like there's also an opportunity for you to talk to people at public colleges like Vol State, and then a big, ginormous university like Western Kentucky, where you get to talk to people of all kinds of religious backgrounds. And that way you get to learn more about them, and then you can actually learn ways to, how do I approach them if I'm wanting to get them to be possibly more involved in a church setting? How do I go about that? So that was something that I really, especially at Western, Western Kentucky, there was all kinds of different ministries that was involved, and different denominations too. And there was things that I taught to. I remember they had a Baptist campus ministry there, and I got to learn all kinds of things about how they also viewed Christianity as well. So it was really interesting. And then there was a lot of people that could care less about God and religion too.
Well, and that's really what this podcast really grew out of was I think God just kept putting it on my heart, because it would come and then I'd leave it alone. It would come, I'd leave it alone. Finally, I think God just finally said, hey, I'm trying to get your attention. And I met Stanley, I met Jessica. I mean, things just fell into place. I mean, without them, we wouldn't be here. And the thing that's interesting about it is, because I do teach economics, I mean, it's the idea that we live in the Bible Belt. This is the traditional, hardcore, and Church of Christ, definitely First Baptist Church of Christ. I mean, those who drive around the little small communities outside of Nashville, and I mean, that's what you see. Those are the rocks. But there are also many of them are dying. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But anyway, so the idea is that is this what's called, I call it New South Christians. In other words, are these our grandparents, our parents, old school Christians? All these people that are moving in, that are coming, kind of like Western Kentucky, all these people that are moving into Nashville, we've had pagans, we've had people into crystals, we've had atheists, we've had, different strict interpretation Catholic, non-strict. I mean, you start to imagine it, it's shown up here so far. So the whole podcast was around the ideas, your generation, Generation Z, and how different it is. Like, I'm not trying to embarrass you or anything, but I taught in Portland,
go right ahead.
and you said you were from Portland, and we were talking about the Church of Christ. I remember one time at Portland, I had a guest speaker, and it was a woman that had gone to the divinity school at Vanderbilt, and one of the young ladies in the class, one of my favorite students, in fact, she was valedictorian that year, said basically she had issue with the woman talking to us in class, and that she was also a pastor of a Methodist church in Portland, that she would stand in a position of authority over men, because the strict interpretation of the Bible as their congregation viewed it is that's not correct. And then she explained to her that she was going to hell. And then another time in the class, she explained that I was going to hell. But the funny thing about it, I got called down to the principal's office and it was interpreted. Mr. Fuqua, did you tell one of our students they're going to go to hell? I said, no, Mr. Short, I was told I was going to hell. He said, that's okay. But
logic in that's a little questionable. But yeah.
So the whole point is that, you know, we come from a more conservative way. But when I look out Vol State's window or look in the classrooms, I see that world is gone. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. So what I was really, my passion is kind of exploring who you people are, how it's changed. And since you're from here, so, I mean, your parents, your grandparents, so I'm assuming they go to the same church or you've grown up in it. So yes. What do they think? Do they look around and go, oh my gosh, we're in trouble?
There are all kinds of things that have changed a lot. And the way to look at it is every denomination does this. Mm-hmm. You have certain things that are you follow the Bible because that's what the Bible says to do. Mm-hmm. And then there are other things that you do that are just kind of traditions.
Right.
And so I would say, starting with my parents and something just in the last few years, like with me, I pointed out, well, hey, there's a few things like here and there that feels like that this is getting pushed just because it's more tradition instead of what the Bible says.
Okay.
And my parents were kind of thinking the same thing. So we kind of were thinking a lot about where we would like to go to church. And the one that I grew up in, I have many, many friends there and great people there. But we ended up now I'm actually going to this church in Lebanon, which is a fun story because the preacher that was at my former congregation, Matt Miller is his name, he actually got the job over at the 109 Church of Christ where I go currently. Right. And me and him were really tight. So he talked with me for a while like, hey, I think you would actually really benefit a lot. You've been thinking about different things spiritually, and I think you might actually fit in at this one a little better. Okay. And so I started visiting over at that congregation, and I really loved the atmosphere and everything there. We've actually, and it's interesting too, the approach that the 109 Church has started is they actually do a 2 service. And a lot of people, when they say that, oh, we're going to have 2 services on Sunday morning, they think, oh, well, this is going to be a traditional service first, and then we'll have a contemporary service later.
I see what you're saying.
But the approach there is they decided, okay, well, we have 2 preachers, Wayne Miller and Matt Miller, no relationship, believe it or not. So they have 2 Millers that are preachers. We're going to have one of them preach both, and then on Sunday night service, the other one will preach.
Oh, I didn't know you went Sunday night. A lot of churches have canned Sunday night and canned Wednesday. I remember when I was coming through the Baptist, it was like, we had Wednesday night, we had Sunday night, we had Sunday morning. I mean, those were the, the things. So even this has changed. So, well, would you consider yourself more of maybe a moderate? I mean, because you, compared to what my experience has been with the traditional Church of Christ, you seem pretty open-minded.
I think that's the way to approach anything when you're talking about religious things, because there are so many things that a lot of people just listen to their preachers or their pastors talk about things. And I think that that's okay to an extent, but I think it's better to look at the Bible and read things for yourself as well. So,
well, see, can I tell you, not to butt in, but that is so far removed from what my experience with the church. And I'm not singling out Church of Christ. It's just because we're talking about your experience. And I find that very fascinating, which once again would fit with the idea of you're a New South Christian, because can I tell you, back in the old days, since I'm a lot older than you, the last time I had a serious conversation on issues of sexuality, whatever, the old lady looked at me and said, "You gonna split hell wide open?" And I remember my grandmother from over in Springfield, Tennessee. Yep, David, don't be like that. They're going to split hell wide open, which brings me to a question I have to ask you. Do you believe in heaven and hell?
Oh, yes, I do.
So what is hell? Describe hell to me.
Hell,
I've always enjoyed asking people.
Hell is a place that God, I really don't think intends us to be in, but we make choices in our lives.
Okay.
And we sometimes, when we choose to follow something else that of more importance than God, then that is where Satan dwells and his basically his followers, and that's where. So I do believe hell exists. The Bible clearly talks about.
But would
the
you
difference.
describe it? I mean, if we were in hell, how would you describe? I mean, is it just? I've heard weeping, gnashing of teeth. Is it?
Right.
I've heard it described. One person on the podcast, she was great, described it as total darkness.
Yeah.
To be totally removed from the Father, Jesus, Father in heaven. So I'm in total darkness. And I wouldn't even know you're here. I could maybe hear you, but no connection. I thought, man, that just gave me goosebumps. And so how would you describe it, or what's your visual image of it?
My vision of hell is, I think that there's two ways that people look at it. They either look at it as like, oh, well, this is because the Bible talks about there being a second death, which means that the first is a physical death and the second is a spiritual death. And in a way that is correct, but I think the spiritual death is pretty much right following after the physical death and when the judgment day comes. So I think some people either look at it as like you just basically are burned up immediately, but the way I have seen the Bible describe it is it's actually like heaven, it's everlasting, but instead of being with God and receiving your reward for eternity, you're receiving punishment
for eternity.
For eternity.
Well, then let's flip the other side. How do you describe heaven?
Heaven, I think, is the place, that's where God obviously lives, and that's where He wants all of us to come, the people that, because every one of us are a creation made from God. And heaven is an eternity, and a lot of people look at it as like, oh, we're going to sing praise God all the time. And I think that that is true to an extent, but I think it's also about just imagine the best things in your life that have happened, and you have those memories forever, all of the positive. I think there are some ideas of also negativity, but it also mentions about God wiping away those tears. So if you have a negative thought, God is immediately there to comfort you, and the positives outweigh the negatives.
Well, it's interesting. I saw Billy Graham on Johnny Carson, this is old school from way back.
Okay.
And he asked Billy Graham, probably one of the greatest pastors ever in the history of this country at least, and what heaven was. And he said he believes that we will travel between planets at the speed of thought, that we will do things, but that he loves golf. He said, I think they'll have the best golf courses in the world as far as that goes, so I think it's cool. Well, let me ask you a few other more controversial things, but then I want to explore the things that you and Jessica are doing, because when you were just sitting here talking about heaven and hell and some other, your background experience going to Western and how, being educated, looking at things. So I think that's pretty cool. So here's the other thing. Young men like you that I've had on here, I've asked all of them pretty much similar question. How, as a Christian, because you've identified yourself as a Christian, how do you handle this world we're in where people want to know, what do you think about LGBTQI, and I don't know how many more letters there are beyond that. So how do you handle that if you're sitting around your contemporaries and people are talking about it?
I think the best way to look at it is define, what God in the Bible with God creating Adam and Eve as a man and then making the woman from Adam. And I think the best way to describe it, and I'm not going to just say immediately it's wrong, but what I will challenge people to think is think about how God created the man and woman to be together, and how does He feel about us trying to play into those ideas and try to create our own ideas of what gender is. That's the challenge I'm going to just leave the audience thinking about with that, just kind of that simple thought process.
Well, yeah, and the reason I ask that of everybody, it's not to, try to single you out and take a controversial issue, but I've had many, particularly young men up here say, if you're on a date or if you're interacting with people, contemporaries, and the subject comes up, if you don't give the right answer, the acceptable answer, you're canceled.
Right.
Which simply means I'm going to go on social media, I'm going to trash Christian. So I don't know. I'm not of your generation, but that offends me. I mean, as a person that went to college who loves, academics, who loves the idea of learning, like you laid out, questioning, pursuing, looking at different points of view. That's not trying to indoctrinate you, but for people to have that kind of view, it's like, well, here's the right way. Well, yours is wrong. Check you off, cancel you. Now I'm going to, trash you and do all the things I can to punish you for it. I think that is a really scary proposition if I'm in your generation.
Yes.
I don't think I would thrive well in it. I think you'd have to have a lot of cancellations on me.
Right. Well, who's to say I'm thriving in it?
Yeah.
So,
Well,
because I'm kind of like, I'm challenging the thought, and people are like, well, why can't you just say yes or simple yes or no?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I find it very offensive, like in classroom, people want to boil things down to these real simplistic things, but the real things of your generation, in my opinion, that matter are very complex. I mean, we're in the middle of this raging political campaign. I don't even know how to describe it, not even going to attempt right now. But I will tell you this, when you look at it, the issues that are not being discussed are huge. I mean, I teach economics. We're looking at $35 trillion worth of debt being pushed to your generation. If you'll notice in the first, and I use the term debate loosely, no discussion. We passed both candidates. We moved totally away from that. Right. Most of the really big things that really are challenging your generation in this society have not been discussed, are not going to be discussed because nobody wants that talked about. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, because you had said, I think, did you vote in the last? So this should be your second election,
yes,
right?
Yeah, I voted in 2020 as well.
So how do you feel? And I'm not talking about the candidates, but just the atmosphere. I mean, you're a guy that's gone to college. You're a guy that just said a minute ago, you try to look at different points of view. Well, how do you figure out the different points of view of these people when they never talk about anything that seems to matter?
I think that we're living in kind of a scary time right now because you look at the political parties. The Republican Party has their own agendas. The Democrat Party has their own agendas. And that's a scary thought because they're basically telling people how to think based on what their agendas, and they're so polar opposites that divides people so much because they either think one extreme or this extreme instead of using common sense and individuality to think, well, how do I look at it based on my own experience?
But how do you feel when somebody like me sits there and tells you you're on the hook for $35 trillion? I mean, really, you're a young man with maybe 20, 22, 1. I don't know what your age is, but when somebody tells you you're on the hook for $35 trillion and we've got to start somehow paying that back or paying that down or there's going to be severe consequences, well, how do you feel about your future? I mean, do you feel like you'll ever be able to afford a house? Do you think you're going to be able to have a family or whatever? If you're trying to pay for the sins of my generation projected onto yours?
I think if we're talking about economics, it is really also kind of a scary time because this is something I've thought about as well thoroughly. And I still live with my parents right now because right now I don't have enough money to afford a house. Yeah. And I think
you are the poster child for exactly what we're talking about. I mean, I look at the numbers. You're a college graduate, you're still living at home. By any of our traditional definitions, and I'm not trying to condemn you, I'm just saying, you look at it, that's what most people face.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that? I mean, is it tough or is it?
Yeah, it's kind of tough because, it would be nice if I could live on my own. And if I had, and I've thought about a lot of people my age are moving into apartments now, but you kind of find yourself getting to a hole because it's going to take you possibly decades, if ever, to actually be able to afford your own home. Now, people might look at that a little bit differently, like, well, maybe I'll never be a homeowner. I'll just be satisfied with living in an apartment. But that's definitely a separate way of thinking, like from people generations ago, like, oh, well, you need to own everything. You have to own your own house. You have to own your own
ownership
car.
was the way to wealth, and ownership is the
Right.
definition of success. I mean, you said it a minute ago before we started, you were talking about interviewing for the first job or something, not making very much money, et cetera. I lived at home when I first started, so this isn't a unique thing. What is unique is how widespread it is in your generation, and how, I tell you, every person I've had on here has talked about depression, anxiety, suicide, and not all for economic reasons, other reasons too, but that was part of it.
Yeah.
And so when I am sitting teaching in class, you represent the largest generation, 88 million of you, Gen Z, and they're upset, they're depressed, by definitions of success where they are now, don't feel good about it going forward. And I'm like, man, that is a potential tsunami that's
Right.
waiting for us. And I'm looking at this election, and just from my point of view, and I'm going, this is not good. I mean, we're not even having the discussion. How am I gonna make a conclusion about something we don't even talk about? So, and here's another thing. I think somewhere in the Bible it says the people perish for lack of a vision or something like that. What is the vision that you see from this political campaign? Does President Biden have a vision? Does President Trump have a vision? I haven't heard anybody tell me what the future of America is going to look like under either of these people.
Right. No, I think both of them, for the most part, are following whatever their party agendas are. And
Okay.
so I think that that's kind of a scary thought. And what's sad, too, is we've seen both of these candidates already debating against each other once, and it really didn't go over well the first time.
No.
Now we're getting to see it second time, possibly even worse now, the second time around. And I will get into, specifics, but I think most people know this. There's all kinds of worry about, whether Biden or Trump, can even make it out of this
Right.
election.
Yeah.
And it's a really scary thought for, other candidates running too, that also, do they have their own vision
Right.
as well?
Well, as somebody that, like I said, you're still at home, you invested in your education, et cetera. So how do you feel going forward? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you pragmatic? I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to get a sense because, you represent what we say to do. Work hard. You sound like you come from a good family. You have spiritual beliefs or something, which are yours. You went to a 4-year school up the road. I assume most of the education here was, for the most part, free.
Yes.
And then you have Western, so I'm hoping that you didn't come out with a lot of debt or anything like that. So, you're everything we tell you to do, so how do you feel?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I've got my bachelor's degree, but I come from majoring in broadcasting, and I actually did have, with the help of the station manager here, Diana Monk, I was able to land a part-time gig where I could actually work remotely from home for Cookeville Communications Zimmer Broadcasting. And if you were to ask me anything about the company, it would be all positive. It was a great working atmosphere because I actually did an internship. I worked for them a couple summers ago before my senior year. But unfortunately in that industry, they were struggling so much to even be able to afford me a part-timer. So that was a little bit scary. And of course, after I graduated, I also was looking for jobs. I even had one person that worked at the company tell me, hey, you might want to even look into your options for full-time work because we're not sure if we'd be able to give it to you. So the way I looked at that was, okay, well, I'm going to probably apply for other jobs. But it's so interesting that, and now where I'm at, I actually do have a full-time job I work at, but it's not within my field of where I studied. Mm-hmm. So now I'm kind of exploring the options of do I want to stay with this company I've worked with how long, or do I want to continue driving through my dreams? Well, I would love to get back into doing broadcasting and be able to do something that I feel like I can accredit my talents to. And that's why we've started the Meguiar podcast, is to kind of get a little bit of self-recognition. Of course, we're kind of at a point where we're both amateurs. Of course, Jessica's probably a little bit more, less of an amateur than me, I feel.
Well, she's just good to be around.
Yeah.
We had her on the podcast. Yeah, I know this is going to sound a little creepy if people don't know her, but she puts off such a positive vibe.
She really does.
And and I don't know her very well, but the few times I've been around her, it's just like, you feel this aura.
Yeah.
And I know people listening are probably thinking, "Man, that's a little creepy." But there have been people in my life that when you're around them, you just feel better for having been around them. And I'm not saying they're perfect or anything, but if I could aspire to be anything, I would love to be one of those people, because she just has a positive look. I mean, what is her? Positively Jessica?
Positively Jessica,
But
yeah.
there you go. So that says it all. So anyway, you've opened the door to something I want to go down, if you don't mind.
Yes, let's go down that rabbit hole right now.
Well, it's a rabbit hole, but it connects to you and Jessica, what you're doing. But it also is something that really affected me. So I'll do this real quick because I want to get to you. Is during the pandemic, I was like a lot of people, stuck at home, okay? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to do my whole spiritual background, good and bad. I've had my trip ups and everything, and just say, thankful God doesn't remember my sins, that he's let them go. But anyway, the bottom line was I read a book called Driven to Eternity, or Driven by Eternity, that's what it was. A guy named John Bevere, my brother, who's a pastor, gave it to me. The first part of it, I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't care for his writing style or anything. But the last part changed me. And what it was all about is exactly what you and Jessica are exploring. It's about, why are you here? Does God have a plan for Christian? Do you have a calling? And so in this book, this gentleman writes about when he was just at your age, he talked about that he believed that you have a calling. So God knew you, so I'll use you. God knew Christian was coming 2,000 years ago. He gave you certain talents and gifts, just like we were talking about Jessica's, right?
Right.
All right. So he also has a plan for you. And when Judgment Day comes, because you know how long we're here? It's over. This is eternity. If you measure eternity, this podcast lasts longer than our lives. So the reality of it was, when you're judged, now this isn't the judgment of good and evil. This is the judgment of Christian. I gave you these talents, I gave you these gifts, this is why I sent you. Now you chose this. This is what, if you had gone the way I wanted to go, this is what would have happened. And I don't know, that just, even at my age, I thought, oh my God, how many times in my life have I gone left when I should have gone right? I went right when I should have gone left. So I just got down on my knees and it changed my life. Now, I'm still going through this. I was just listening to a sermon by Dr. Charles Stanley. He's already passed away. And he said, God has a plan for you. And so I just started thinking, that's really what it's all about. Why are you here? What is your plan for you? And what are you going to do? And that's where the internships and trying to walk in faith. So, I mean, what do you think? I mean, because you guys are, you're at that place. I can hear it in your voice answering that question and the passion you have for broadcasting. So how do you plug that in?
I think it's good to always pray about wherever stage of life you're in. And I think about now, like the last year just so much has changed. Like I've gained so much more life experience after college than like during college. Now during college I learned some things too, but after college I've really learned how to have to pick myself up after being, depressed and different things like that.
There you go.
Like, here's the thing. I've had 2 jobs that I lost. One of them, like I mentioned, with Zimmer Broadcasting. Like I said, I think the world of the company still. They were a great place to work with, but they couldn't afford to have me. Then I had another job where I worked in promotions, and they had to let me go because I wasn't meeting their quota. Man, that one in particular really cut me, because it was like, because I take pride in when I work, but for them to tell me I wasn't good enough, that was so hard to hear. But I think what happened with that job is I pretty much got it immediately right after I was let go from Zimmer Broadcasting. And that was a me call. That was not a God call. And I was able to pick up on that. And so I think about the last year, like I changed churches, and then I've got this new job that I had. I never would have had, because there was a guy at my church that referred me to the job I work now at the auto auction. Right. And then trying also with the Meguiar podcast to do something a little different and say, hey, if no one's going to hire me, then I'm going to just do my own thing, and I'm going to work with a collaborative partner, I think, where we can get stuff done.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should say that, because a lot of people, when they ask me, people who know me, the good David, the bad David from the old days or whatever, and they'll say, podcast, New South Christians? And it's not that they think I'm a demon worshiper or whatever, but I've gone through the ups and downs of life like everybody does. But it's kind of funny sitting here now, if you ask me, and I tell everybody this, how's things going at Ball State? I still do my job. I still like students and everything, but I really come here for this podcast. I absolutely love it. It has forced me to examine my life on so many different levels. And meeting all of you guys. I mean, we've had, 20-something people come through here. Everybody who sat there has taught me something. And so when Jessica and you mentioned the idea of doing a podcast dedicated to like internships and trying to connection, I mean, it's one of the ways, at least in my opinion, I think we're going to have to make it through with your generation, which means my generation has a responsibility to try to generate these internships to help you, to guide you. And then the other part, if you're a Christian like you and me, is if God's got a plan, right. I mean, come on. He's the best internship recommender I can imagine, if that's the right way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, he can open any door, he can close any door. So it's the idea of really walking in faith, because even me, I just finished my 38th year of teaching, and I really think I have one more rodeo left. So I just told God, whatever you want me to do. So maybe I need an internship for later in life to what he wants me to do. And maybe this is it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, to be you on your end and to deal with this and have such a positive attitude is a real testimony. Because I think there's a lot of young men, at least we've had on here, that share the same view. You can almost smell it on them. I mean, it's like, this is not where I expected to be, even though you're still early at this point. So the anxiety, the depression, the things that come with it is something I think Gen Z is probably going to have to really deal with, and we're going to have to deal with, because you represent really the hope for the future. I know that sounds corny, but you really are.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
And I think about May of last year, my plans was to move to Cookeville, Tennessee, and them just hand me the full-time job, because I'm like, I've earned it. I've worked there a couple of years.
There you go.
But they told me, well, that may not be a reality. So then I had to start planning and scratching. And I feel like most of last year, almost like I was almost trying to do my own thing. But then when pieces started coming together, like with this, when I started going to a new church, when I got this new job, when I did the podcast, all of this started connecting together. I'm like, you know what? I'm really seeing where God's direction is taking me.
Sure.
Now, do I know exactly what's going to happen in the future? No, of course not.
Of course not.
But I'm starting to see that at least God is working in a path where last year I just didn't know.
Right. And you know what's funny? Out of not knowing, I mean, that's where the faith walk comes. Because, the bottom line is, like, I was talking to God for him coming up here to the podcast. I'm thinking, I've really missed this. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it. God put into my mind what you want me to talk about or the things you want me to do. And I just had this huge conversation all the way up here. And then I've been having a lot of conversations with him about my time at Ball State, And one of the sermons I was listening to this weekend, it was really cool, said, what if God said or told you, in my case, go ahead and retire because I can. Right now, quit your job. Would you?
Well,
and I thought, but I'm talking about me. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Would I? And this pastor was talking about it. He knew several people that did. But, I mean, that's walking in faith. That's truly believing. And I guess it would be an opportunity to find out, are you really walking it, or are you just talking it?
That's a great way of looking at it, and I have to make sure that I keep myself in thought and meditate with God in prayer and be like, hey, is this really what you want me to be doing right now? Because like I said, I was trying to plan my own thing last year after I graduated college, and I think God told me pretty quick, I've got a different plan for you, and this is going to be, not everything's going to line up the way you want it to, because I think people just expect their walk to God to be like, God, just hand me this job or hand me, these connections. Yeah. But God leads you on your own path.
Well, I always remember, because we're getting near the end, I always remember one of my favorite quotes from church was, I knew you before you were formed in your mother's womb, and I knew the plans I had for you, and they were to bless you, and very positive. Man, every time I think about that, it just blows my hair back. I mean, I knew you before you were formed in your mother's womb. I'm like, wow. I mean, so things like that, if you're truly walking that way. So anyway.
And I think Jeremiah 29:11 also talks about it. Yeah.
That's it, exactly, 29:11. That's good. All right, before we go, I always like to end on a positive note. So tell me something good. How you feeling looking forward? Is there anything that you feel good about, you're optimistic about, or et cetera? Or if you were talking to Gen Z and say, hey, I know how you feel. I know how you do
absolutely.
All right. In other words, do we have hope for the future? Do you feel good?
And I think going back to your point about, like, we talk about this country. First of all, don't put your faith in what's going on in the world right now. Put your faith in what God is telling you about a better afterlife. So if we continue to put faith in what's going on right now, I may never be able to reach the exact dreams I want to. But I think having that idea of being a child of God, that is a lot of, and that's why I encourage anyone that watches this to give God and religion a little chance. I know that people sometimes twist it and make it into their own, but that's why I encourage people to look at it the way that they interpret it and that's the way to look at it, is if you put your faith in this country, man, you're going to run into all kinds of problems.
Lord knows we got problems.
Yes, we sure do. Yeah.
Well, in closing, I just want to say I want to thank Christian for being on the show. And I got to tell you, I feel more optimistic about the future now because I think he definitely has the positive attitude. So, and we'll be looking forward to Positively Jessica. And what do you call yours? The Meguiar?
The Meyer and Meguiar podcast.
Okay.
So it's interesting because we both actually have tags. She puts it more on her social media than mine. Mine is the Catching Up with Chris show that I do from 12 to 3 Mondays. And then she comes up with Positively Jess show from 3 to 6 on 88.5 WVCP, which is our station affiliate right here at Vol State. But the Meyer Meguiar is just our last names. It was kind of like we were just brainstorming the names. Like, why don't we just combine our last names, because they both start with M. And I thought about it a little bit, like, my last name is so hard to spell, I don't think we're going to get into any legal issue. So, but yeah, Meyer is her last name, Meguiar is mine.
Well, I will tell you this too, you're definitely a New South Christian, because the conservatives I remember at Church of Christ, I don't think they're as open-minded as you are. So I definitely am excited about that too, because I think, and a lot of times people think education is the enemy of religion. I don't think that's true at all. I think God gave you a mind, he gave you the ability to learn things, et cetera, and to do good things. So I think it's a positive, not a negative. And I'm not trying to turn everybody into a liberal. I always tell people in my class, I'm not trying to teach you what to think. I'm trying to help you, teach you how to think. You've got to figure out the best way to do it. And my way might not be the best way, and I had my shot. So now it's your turn. So anyway, so just want to thank everybody. And hey, if you enjoyed what you saw, recommend us to somebody. And God bless you and have a happy day.